Hey everybody, today we're talking about DSLR cameras. These things have been around a long time and people are snatching these things up for a lot of reasons. You get the interchangeable lens, which gives you the option of telephoto photo taking. It gives you the option of buying some aftermarket mounts to be able to attach the camera to things like telescopes. But they're also taking some high-def video, which makes it really appealing to a lot of people. Now luckily, the manufacturers are putting out cameras that will take fantastic pictures even if you just leave them in the full auto mode, which is what a lot of people do. But if you want to get off the beaten path and take some more creative pictures, artistic pictures, and kind of experiment with the full capacity of these cameras, there's a few modes and options and features that you really want to start to explore. So we're going to talk about those today.
Excuse me?
I
got a question.
Okay, go ahead.
How did the camera get that funny name?
Great question. A DSLR stands for Digital Single Lens Reflex. And what that tells you basically is, in the body of the camera, there is a 45-degree lens or mirror that sits right here, and when the image comes in through this lens, it hits this mirror, bounces up to another mirror, and comes out to the viewfinder. So when you're looking through this thing, you're seeing exactly what the lens is seeing. This arrangement can be problematic for anybody who's used to using the LCD view on a point and shoot to take all of your pictures, because this Z formation is all designed to take pictures through here. In order to look at and view pictures on the LCD prior to taking the picture, that lens needs to snap out of the way, stay out of the way, and then basically shoot the image directly back to the image sensor once the shutter opens. Which you can do, but the problem is that all of the autofocus sensors actually lie up here in the top of the camera. So when the image comes in, bounces off this mirror, and come up here, that's where all the autofocus happens. And if you bypass this lens by taking pictures from here, then you run into that problem. So what you notice is when you press the shutter button halfway down, then this screen will go blank, and that happens because the lens drops into place, the image bounces up to the autofocus area, it makes sure everything is great, and then just as you take the picture, the lens pops out of the way again, and the shutter snaps, and the photo happens. So you have to get used to the idea that if you're going to take pictures with any kind of efficiency and speed, you're going to have to look through the viewfinder. You're going to have to stop looking at pictures here before you take them. Now this also happens with video. If you switch the camera over to video mode, that lens pops out of the way again, and it goes straight into the image sensor that sits in the back of the camera housing.
I would like to get a picture of a baseball flying right past home plate. How would I do that?
That's a great question. To get that kind of picture, you're going to want to play around with your shutter speed. Before we get to talking about shutter speed, let's look at the mode selection dial and just take a look at the different options that are available to you and how you can get to different types of shutter speed programming. Alright, so this is the mode selector wheel on my camera. I'm not going to talk much about the stuff that you see on the bottom of the circle, because those are the automatic modes you're probably pretty familiar with in terms of any kind of point and shoot. Today we're talking about the TV and the AV. The TV is shutter priority, and the camera will adjust everything but how long the shutter is open in that mode. AV is aperture priority, and the camera will adjust everything except for the f-stop value of the aperture. Okay, let's get back to your question about taking a picture of a baseball hurling across the home plate. Those things are moving pretty fast. You can use the pre-programmed sport mode, which is going to take a lot of the guesswork out of the picture, and it's going to do the best it can to give you a quality picture. But if you want to take the control into your own hands, you want to move over to the shutter priority mode, which on the Canon is TV on the dial, and on Nikon's it's going to be just S for shutter. So what happens in that mode is you get to pick how quickly that shutter opens and closes. And we typically think of these in fractions of a second. They can be much longer than that if you're in a very low light environment. You know, a nighttime shoot, if you're traveling to, let's say, Washington, D.C. or Philadelphia or someplace with a lot of historical monuments and you want to do some nighttime shooting, they could be much longer, 1, 2, 3 seconds, and if you're doing time-lapse, then certainly it could be much, much more than that. But ultimately, for most of the picture taking that people do at sporting events and, people running around the backyard, that type of thing, we talk about shutter speeds in a fraction of a second. The nice thing about picking the shutter priority mode is that the camera knows that you're not paying much attention to aperture. And we're going to talk about aperture in a minute. But these two things work really closely hand in hand. So does the ISO. And I'm not going to talk a lot about that because really between shutter and aperture, you're going to get most of the creative design that at least beginners need. So in shutter priority, you want to pick the speed that shutter opens and closes that's going to give you the result you want. Let's look at a couple of examples that I shot just around the house using the ceiling fan in the boys' room. Okay, so in this picture you can see that the camera did not pick up any individual definition of the fan blades. They're totally blurred together. And the shutter speed here was 1/4 of a second, so 1/4. Now in this picture, nothing has changed with the fan. It's running at exactly the same speed, but I've changed the shutter speed to 1/125th of a second. And you can clearly tell that it has taken a much faster shutter speed and has begun to capture some of the individual definition of that blade. Alright, so this is the last example of shutter speed. I've got the speed set to 1/400th of a second, and you can see that we dipped a little bit darker into the underexposed because the lens wasn't really able to keep up with that kind of shutter speed, but at the same time you can see that the blade looks like it's nearly standing still.
I got a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Didn't you say something about aperture?
Oh yeah, thanks for asking about that. Aperture is so important, and it's really used by a lot of people to control what we call depth of field. So you've noticed depth of field in two ways. One is if you've seen a portrait photo where everything behind the subject is really blurry. That's what we call a shallow depth of field because it's focusing on the person or the object right in focus and in view, and everything beyond it is shallower or softer is what we call it, and it's out of focus. Then a deep depth of field is more like landscaping or landscape photos. And so if you're outside and you see this nice sweeping vista and everything looks beautiful and everything is more or less in focus, then that's all part of aperture control. Okay, so how does aperture work? Well, it turns out that not only does the camera have a shutter that opens and closes in front of the image sensor, but the lens, that interchangeable lens, has also got a, part of the lens is how much of it will open and close. And so if you adjust the aperture to a big aperture, then you'll have a wide open lens. And if you don't, then it'll be very, very small. So the goofy thing about aperture is there's a number associated with it. So like in shutter speed, we're talking about fractions of a second usually. In aperture, we refer to them as f-stops. I don't know why, it's just what they do. But it correlates to a mathematical formula that talks about how much of the lens is actually open and exposing the image to the image sensor. The weird thing about it is that it's a little counterintuitive. So if you have an f-stop on the lower end of the numerical scale, so let's say 1.8 or 2 or maybe even something in the 5s, that actually is a pretty full lens. The aperture is wide open. It's a huge thing. Now if you go to the other end of the spectrum and you say that you've got a f-stop of maybe 36, then that lens is really constricted. It's a very small amount of area that's open for the image to go through. That poses a problem when you're talking about taking a picture, because with such a small area of the lens to be open, it's hard to get light through. And so what you'll find if you have your aperture set that way, it's the shutter will actually be open for a long time. And if you don't have a tripod or something, you're going to get some camera shake, and your picture's not going to turn out very good. So make sure that if you're on that end of the spectrum, you're going to have to stabilize the camera somehow. So what does this all mean? Well, let's take a look at another couple of samples I've taken from around the house to kind of help explain what type of picture you're going to get with what aperture setting.
The aperture in this photo is 3.5, which means that I focused on Wild Thing here in the front, and everything behind him is pretty fuzzy. Alright, and for this one, we've dialed the aperture up to f11, and you can tell we're getting pretty close to landscaping because everybody is more or less focused, but Mater in the background is still just a little bit fuzzy. Alright, in this final photo you can tell that everything is pretty well in focus, both front and back, and I've got the aperture dialed up to 22 on this one. Now for this picture and the last one I used a tripod just to minimize any kind of body shake that might influence the quality of the photo.
Okay, I have a couple of more examples of the same settings with the ceiling fan and the bears that I want to show you what happens if your camera is physically unable to take the picture that you want. So I have a very entry level. I didn't spend a ton of money on the different components, and so there's some real limitations. Let's take a look at those examples and we'll kind of walk around or walk through what happened there.
Alright, so this is the final picture that I took with the fan blade series. So this was shutter speed, and I have this one dialed up to 1/600th of a second, which is extremely fast. But the problem is my lens was not able to have a large enough aperture. So at the 5.6 or thereabouts aperture, what I really needed probably was about a 1.8, and my lens just couldn't do it. So it's way underexposed and the picture is very dark. Alright, so this picture isn't quite as dark as the fan blade picture, but it is quite a bit darker than the other bear pictures. And so at the aperture setting that I had this one, it was unable to collect enough light, and so it underexposed the photo too.
So hopefully that helps explain a little slice of the camera that you're not used to using, and maybe takes some of the mystery away from it. Here's the reality. You could watch this video or any of the other videos 100 times, but you're going to learn a lot more by going out into the world with your camera and snapping photos. Out into the world might mean in, a part of your house or apartment, kind of like the bear picture. It might mean going out and trying to capture some photos of waterfalls. Who knows? That's all up to you. But you got to test it out. So you got a memory card, fill it up. I've actually got one memory card dedicated specifically to just playing around and going out and testing the camera, and what does this look like if I shoot it like this, and what does that look like? And then I have a whole separate card set aside for real photos that we want to take of the family and activities that we go on and things. So however you do it, just know that you're not going to get good at it until you get out there and actually use it.